The candles had barely been lit when Alina Winslow saw her whole world break apart in front of 300 guests. She had walked into the ballroom of Ashcombe Manor with her chin high and her heart full, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that her mother had chosen especially for tonight. Tonight was supposed to be the night her engagement to Lord Julian Hartley became the talk of the season. Instead, within 10 minutes of stepping through the tall double doors, she watched Julian lead her younger sister Margaret onto the dance floor with a familiarity that made her stomach turn cold. At first, Alina told herself it meant nothing. Siblings of a betrothed woman danced with the groom all the time. It was polite, it was expected. But as the music swelled and Julian's hand rested too low on Margaret's waist, as his head bent close enough to whisper something that made her sister laugh in a way Alina had never heard her laugh before, the truth settled into her bones like ice water. She was not imagining it. Alina stood near the refreshment table, a glass of lemonade forgotten in her gloved hand, and watched the two people she loved most in the world dance as though she did not exist. Around her, conversations continued. Fans fluttered. Laughter rose and fell like waves. No one else seemed to notice what she was seeing, or if they did, no one dared to look at her directly, which was somehow worse. When the dance ended, Julian did not return to her side. He walked Margaret to the edge of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, and the two of them stood close together, heads bowed, speaking in low voices. Alina set down her glass. Her hands had begun to shake, and she did not want anyone to see. She crossed the ballroom floor with as much composure as she could gather, weaving between clusters of guests who nodded politely, unaware that her carefully built life was collapsing beneath her silk slippers. When she reached the window, she heard the last words of their conversation clearly enough that there could be no mistake, no kind explanation, no comfortable lie to tell herself later. Julian was telling Margaret that he could not go through with the wedding, not to Alina. That his heart, he said, had changed course somewhere between their two families' long friendship and this very season, and it had changed course toward her sister. Margaret's face, when Alina came into view, went white as bone. Julian turned as well, and for a moment none of them spoke. The music continued behind them, oblivious. A servant passed nearby with a tray of champagne, and the clink of glasses seemed impossibly loud in the silence between the three of them. "Alina," Julian said finally, as though her name alone might soften what he had done. She did not answer him. She could not right away, because her throat had closed around something sharp and hot. She looked at her sister instead, searching Margaret's face for some sign of guilt, some flicker of shame that would tell her this had happened by accident, that Margaret had not wanted it, that she had fought against it. She found nothing of the kind, only fear, fear of being caught, not fear of having done wrong. "How long?" Alina asked. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though it cost her everything to keep it that way. Neither of them answered. "How long," she repeated, "has this been happening?" "It isn't what you think," Margaret said quickly, reaching a gloved hand toward her sister's arm. Alina stepped back before her sister could touch her. "Don't," she said, "don't you dare." By now, a few nearby guests had noticed that something was wrong. Alina could feel their eyes on the back of her neck, could hear the whispers beginning to spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, quick and impossible to stop once it had caught. She thought of her mother, seated near the older ladies across the room, still smiling, still unaware that in a matter of minutes the story of tonight would not be her daughter's happy engagement, but her daughter's public humiliation. She thought of her father, who had spent months arranging this match, who had spoken with such pride about the union of their family with the Hartleys. She thought of every dinner, every letter, every quiet evening she had spent believing that Julian loved her, and she felt something inside her chest crack clean in half. "I need air," she said, though no one had asked. She turned and walked, not ran, because running would have given the whole room permission to stare even more than they already were. She kept her back straight and her steps even until she reached the terrace doors, and only once she had slipped through them into the cool night air did she allow her composure to falter. The garden beyond Ashcombe Manor was vast and dark, lit only by the pale glow of lanterns strung along the paths and the distant light spilling from the ballroom windows. Elena walked quickly, putting distance between herself and the music, the laughter, the whispers that she knew were already forming into a story that would follow her for the rest of the season. She did not stop walking until she reached a stone bench half hidden beneath a willow tree, far enough from the house that the noise of the party had faded into a soft, meaningless hum. There, finally, she allowed herself to sit, and there, finally, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her engagement was over. Her sister, her own blood, had taken the man she loved, or the man she had believed she loved, and had done so without a single word of warning, without a single moment of hesitation that Elena could see. Tomorrow the entire city would know that Julian Hartley had jilted Elena Winslow for her younger, prettier, more charming sister. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and closed her eyes, trying to hold back the sound that wanted to escape her. "You are going to ruin your gloves that way," a voice said from somewhere behind her. Elena startled and turned quickly, her heart pounding. A tall man stood a few feet away, half in shadow, half lit by the distant lantern light. She recognized him at once, though she had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with him in her entire life. Sebastian Hale, the Duke of Ravensworth, a man known throughout the city more for his silence than his conversation, more for his absence from society than his presence in it. He was not smiling. He rarely did if the rumors were to be believed. But there was something in the way he looked at her now, something quiet and steady, that made Elena feel less like a spectacle and more like a person. "Forgive me," she said, wiping quickly at her eyes and rising from the bench. "I did not realize anyone else was out here." "Please sit," he said. "I have no wish to send you running back toward that ballroom before you are ready." Something in his tone told her he had seen, or at least heard, enough to understand what had happened. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, shame layering itself over grief. "You witnessed it," she said. "It was not really a question." "I witnessed enough," the Duke admitted. He came a few steps closer, though he kept a respectful distance, and clasped his hands behind his back in the manner of a man used to standing at the edges of rooms rather than the center of them. "Lord Hartley is a fool. I have thought so for some time, though tonight he has confirmed it rather thoroughly." Despite everything, a small, startled laugh escaped Elena's lips, quickly followed by fresh tears, because laughing felt like a betrayal of her own heartbreak, and yet she could not seem to stop either reaction from coming. "I am sorry," she said, pressing her fingers beneath her eyes. "I do not usually behave this way in front of strangers." "We are not entirely strangers," the Duke said. "Though I will grant you, we have never spoken more than a handful of words to one another at any given gathering." "No," Elena agreed, "we have not." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. Then he said, in a tone so measured it startled her more than any dramatic gesture could have, "I have a proposal for you, Lady Elena, and I would ask that you hear the whole of it before you decide I have lost my mind." Elena blinked at him. "A proposal?" "Not the kind you are imagining, born of sentiment or romance," he clarified quickly. "I am talking about a practical arrangement. One that would benefit us both, I think, if you are willing to consider it." She studied him carefully, uncertain whether this was some strange kindness or some stranger cruelty dressed up as kindness. "Your Grace, I have just been humiliated in front of half the city. I do not think I am in any state to consider proposals of any kind tonight." "That," he said, "is precisely why I am making the offer now, rather than waiting for some more convenient moment when you have had time to build your defenses back up and refuse me out of pride rather than reason." Elena almost smiled again, despite herself. There was something disarming about his bluntness, something that cut through the fog of her misery just enough to let a little curiosity in. "Go on then," she said. "Tell me your proposal, Your Grace, before I decide you truly have lost your mind." The Duke studied her for a long moment before he spoke again, and when he finally did, his voice was low, steady, and entirely without pretense. "Marry me," he said. Not for love. I will not insult you by pretending affection I do not yet feel, nor will I ask you to pretend the same. But marry me, and by morning, the story circulating through this city will not be about how Lord Hartley humiliated you for your own sister. It will be about how the Duke of Ravensworth, a man who has turned down every eligible woman in the kingdom for the better part of a decade, chose you above all others, on the very night you were wronged. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she could not speak at all, could only stare at him beneath the moonlight filtering through the willow branches, trying to determine whether he was serious. "You cannot mean that," she finally managed. "I assure you I do. We barely know each other." "That is true," he said, "and it is also, I would argue, one of the advantages of my proposal rather than a flaw in it. We have no old wounds between us, no history of broken promises. What I am offering you is simple. A marriage built on respect, on partnership, on protection, rather than the kind of romantic illusion that has just cost you so dearly tonight." Eleanor looked away from him, out toward the dark shapes of the garden hedges, and thought of the ballroom she had fled from, thought of Margaret's white face, thought of Julian's careful, cowardly explanation. She thought of walking back into that house tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of the season, as the woman who had been left at her own engagement ball for her own sister. And then she thought of walking back into that house as the future Duchess of Ravensworth instead. It was not love. The Duke had said so himself plainly, without dressing it up in kinder words. But perhaps, Eleanor thought, love had already shown her exactly how little it could be trusted. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have your pick of any woman in the city, your grace. Why offer this to me, tonight of all nights, when I have nothing left to offer in return but scandal?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, something in his voice had softened, just slightly, just enough for Eleanor to notice. "Because you stood in that ballroom and did not fall apart in front of everyone who wished to watch you do it," he said. "Because you walked out of that room with your back straight, even though I imagine it took every ounce of strength you had left. I have watched a great many women in that ballroom tonight, Lady Eleanor, and not one of them impressed me half so much as you did, in the worst moment of your evening." Eleanor felt something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the moment she had seen Julian's hand on her sister's waist, begin to loosen just slightly. "I will need time," she said. "Not long, but I cannot answer you standing in a garden with my heart still bleeding from an hour ago." "Then take the time you need," the Duke said, inclining his head. "But know that my offer does not have an expiration built into it out of impatience. I meant what I said, Lady Eleanor. Whenever you are ready to answer, I will still be here to hear it." He turned to leave her to her thoughts, and Eleanor, still seated on the stone bench beneath the willow tree, watched his tall figure move back toward the lights of the ballroom, unhurried, unbothered by whatever whispers might greet him when he returned. She sat there for a long while after he had gone, staring up through the branches at the scattered stars, turning his words over and over in her mind. By the time she finally rose to walk back toward the house, her decision had not yet fully formed, but something inside her had shifted all the same. The girl who had walked into that ballroom hoping for a happy engagement was gone. In her place stood someone harder, wearier, and yet, strangely, someone a little more curious about what her life might become if she stopped waiting for love to arrive gently and instead chose, deliberately, to build something else entirely. When she re-entered the ballroom, the whispers rose around her immediately, a low hum of voices that fell silent the moment she passed, only to resume the instant she had moved beyond earshot. She held her head high, exactly as the Duke had said, and crossed the room toward her mother, who took one look at her daughter's face and rose at once, understanding without a single word being spoken that something had gone terribly wrong. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Julian stood near the far wall, speaking quietly with two other gentlemen, his expression carefully arranged into something that might have passed, to a stranger, for calm. Eleanor did not look at him again that night. She left the ball on her mother's arm, ignoring the stares that followed her all the way to the carriage, And as the horses pulled away from Ashcombe Manor and the lights of the party faded behind them, she found herself thinking not of Julian, not even of Margaret, but of a quiet, steady voice in a dark garden, offering her a future built on something other than the broken promises of the past. She did not yet know what her answer would be, but for the first time since she had watched her sister dance away with her fiancé, Alina Winslow felt something other than grief. She felt, however faintly, the beginning of a plan. The carriage ride home was silent except for the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the cobblestones and the occasional soft sound of her mother's fan opening and closing, a nervous habit Alina had noticed since childhood whenever her mother did not know what words to offer. Neither of them spoke of what had happened at the ball. There would be time enough for that conversation tomorrow, when the shock had settled and the questions could no longer be avoided. Alina stared out the carriage window at the dark shapes of the city passing by, the shuttered shop fronts, the occasional glow of a lantern in an upstairs window, and let her mind wander back to the garden, to the willow tree, to the Duke's quiet, unshakable voice offering her an escape she had never imagined asking for. By the time the carriage reached her family's townhouse, she had made no final decision, but a single thought had settled itself firmly in her mind and would not be dislodged. Whatever she chose to do next, she would not do it as the girl who had been left behind. She would do it as a woman who had chosen her own path forward, on her own terms, regardless of what the city whispered about her in the weeks to come. 3 days passed before Alina sent word to the Duke of Ravensworth. 3 days in which she barely left her room, in which trays of food were carried up and carried back down again largely untouched, in which her mother knocked softly on her door each morning and each evening, only to be told, gently but firmly, that Alina needed more time. She was not idle during those 3 days, whatever her mother might have assumed. She thought carefully, turning the Duke's offer over in her mind again and again, examining it from every angle she could imagine. She thought about what it would mean to marry a man she barely knew, a man whose reputation in society was built almost entirely on rumor and distance rather than fact. She thought about what it would mean to remain unmarried instead, to watch Julian and Margaret build a life together while she faded quietly into the background of every gathering, pitied by some, mocked by others. She thought, too, about the way the Duke had looked at her in the garden, not with pity, not with the careful, awkward sympathy she had grown accustomed to receiving from well-meaning acquaintances in the days since the ball. He had looked at her as though she were a person worth respecting, rather than a tragedy worth whispering about. On the morning of the 4th day, Alina rose before dawn, dressed without waiting for her maid, and wrote a short letter in her own hand, sealing it before she could talk herself out of sending it. Your Grace, I have considered your proposal carefully, and I find that I am prepared to hear more of it if your offer still stands. I would welcome the opportunity to speak with you directly at your earliest convenience. Lady Alina Winslow. The reply came faster than she expected. By early afternoon, a note arrived at the Winslow townhouse, written in a firm, economical hand that matched everything Alina had observed about the man himself. He would call upon her the following morning, if that suited, and would bring with him nothing but honest answers to whatever questions she wished to ask. That night Alina barely slept, not from dread, as she might have expected, but from something closer to anticipation, an unfamiliar feeling she did not quite know how to name. The Duke arrived precisely on time the next morning, dressed in dark, unadorned clothing that seemed to suit his quiet manner far better than the elaborate fashions favored by most gentlemen of his rank. Alina received him in the small drawing-room at the front of the house, with her mother seated nearby for propriety's sake, though Mrs. Winslow said little, and mostly observed the two of them with an expression of careful, guarded curiosity. Lady Alina, the Duke said, bowing slightly as he entered, thank you for writing to me. Thank you for coming so promptly, she replied, gesturing for him to sit. I have questions, Your Grace, and I would rather ask them plainly than dance around them, if you do not object. I would expect nothing less, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Ask what you wish. Alina folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself before she spoke. Why do you truly wish to marry, your grace? You have avoided matrimony for a decade, by all accounts, despite considerable pressure from your own family, I imagine, and considerable interest from nearly every eligible woman in the city. Why now? Why me? The Duke did not answer immediately. He seemed to consider his words carefully before he spoke. As though he wanted to be certain, he gave her the truth rather than a comfortable version of it. My family has pressed me for years to secure the succession, he said finally. My mother, before she passed, made it something of a final wish, and my uncle has not let me forget it since. I have resisted, largely because every match presented to me has felt transactional in a way I found distasteful. Women paraded before me like prize cattle, valued for their fortunes or their connections rather than for anything resembling character. And you believe I am different, Elinor said, not quite a question. I believe, the Duke said, that a woman who can walk out of a ballroom with her composure intact, moments after discovering her own sister has taken her fiancé, possesses a strength that cannot be manufactured or performed for an audience. I do not offer you romance, Lady Elinor, because I do not believe I have romance in me to offer, not yet, perhaps not ever. But I can offer you respect. I can offer you a household run on honesty rather than pretense. And I can offer you protection from a society that will otherwise spend the rest of this season delighting in your misfortune. Elinor studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity and finding none. And what would you expect from me in return? Companionship when it is wanted, discretion always, a partner in managing my estates and my household, someone with intelligence and judgment I can rely upon, rather than a decorative addition to my dinner table. Beyond that, I ask for very little, Lady Elinor. I am not a demanding man, whatever rumors you may have heard to the contrary. Despite herself, Elinor felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly. I have heard very few rumors about you at all, your grace, which I suppose is rather the point you are making. Precisely, he said, and for the first time since she had met him, something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his features. Mrs. Winslow, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. Your Grace, forgive my bluntness, but my daughter has just endured a very public heartbreak. I would not wish to see her enter into another arrangement, however practical, only to find herself hurt again. I understand your concern, Mrs. Winslow, the Duke said, turning to face her directly. And I will not pretend I can guarantee a future entirely free of pain. Life offers no such guarantees to anyone, but I can promise you this. I will never deceive your daughter. I will never make promises to her that I do not intend to keep. Whatever else this marriage becomes, it will be built on honesty from its very first day. Elinor watched her mother consider this, watched the careful calculation behind her eyes, the same calculation Elinor herself had been running for days. A duke, offering marriage, offering protection, offering an end to the whispers that had followed their family since the ball. It was, in its own way, an extraordinary gift, however strange the circumstances surrounding it. I would like a few more days to think it over properly, Elinor said finally. Not because I doubt your sincerity, your grace, but because I believe a decision this significant deserves careful thought rather than a hasty answer given in the heat of humiliation. Of course, the Duke said, rising from his chair. Take whatever time you require. I will not press you, nor will I withdraw my offer out of impatience. When you are ready, you need only send word. He bowed to both women and took his leave, and Elinor sat in the quiet drawing-room for a long while afterward, listening to the sound of his carriage pulling away from the house, turning his words over once more in her mind. That evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Winslow townhouse. Margaret, dressed in a modest gray traveling gown, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed, asked to see her sister alone. Elinor nearly refused. Every instinct told her to send Margaret away, to protect the fragile calm she had only just begun to rebuild since the ball. But something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a lingering thread of affection she could not entirely sever, made her agree instead. They sat in the small parlor upstairs, the same room where they had once shared secrets as children, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean for it to happen the way it did," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to know that, Alina. I never meant to hurt you." "You did not mean to hurt me," Alina repeated slowly. "And yet you danced with my fiancé in front of the entire city and allowed him to speak of ending our engagement before he had even spoken to me directly. What exactly did you believe would happen, Margaret, if not this?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though Alina found she could not summon the sympathy she might once have felt automatically for her younger sister's distress. "I fought it at first. I promise you I did. But Julian was so persistent, and I found myself caring for him more than I ever intended, and by the time I realized how far things had gone, I did not know how to stop it without hurting everyone involved." "You did not stop it at all," Alina said. "You simply let it happen, in the most public way possible, without ever giving me the chance to hear it from either of you privately, with any kindness or care for what it might cost me." Margaret had no answer for that. She sat with her hands twisted together in her lap, and Alina watched her sister's carefully composed misery with a strange, distant clarity, as though she were observing the scene from somewhere outside her own body. "I do not know if I can forgive you," Alina said finally. "Not yet, perhaps not for a long while, but I did not invite you here to hear you apologize, Margaret. I invited you here because I wanted to tell you something directly, rather than let you hear it through gossip as I heard about you and Julian." Margaret looked up wary. "I have been offered marriage," Alina said, "by the Duke of Ravensworth." Whatever Margaret had expected to hear, it clearly was not that. Her eyes widened, and for a moment something flickered across her face that Alina could not quite name. Surprise, certainly, but beneath it something that looked remarkably like envy. "The Duke of Ravensworth," Margaret repeated slowly. "He has turned down every woman in the city for years. Why would he choose you of all people so suddenly?" There was something in the way Margaret said it, so all people, that struck Alina harder than perhaps her sister had intended. She held her composure, however, and answered evenly. "Perhaps because he recognized something worth valuing that Julian did not," Alina said. "I have not given him my answer yet, but I intend to consider his offer seriously." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost some of its earlier softness. "I hope, for your sake, that he proves more constant than Julian did." "As do I," Alina said simply, and rose to signal that the conversation had reached its end. After Margaret left, Alina stood alone at her window, watching her sister's carriage disappear down the darkened street, and found that her heart, which she had expected to ache at the sight of her sister leaving in such obvious discomfort, felt instead strangely calm. She thought again of the Duke's steady, honest offer, of his promise never to deceive her, and she thought of Julian's careful, cowardly silence in the days since the ball, his failure to send even a single letter of apology or explanation. The following morning, before her resolve could waver, Alina sent word to the Duke of Ravensworth that she had made her decision, and that she wished to see him at his earliest convenience to accept his proposal. The betrothal was announced within the week, and the effect on the city was immediate and overwhelming. Where once the whispers had circled around Alina's humiliation at the ball, they now circled around the astonishing news that the reclusive Duke of Ravensworth, a man who had declined every eligible match presented to him for the better part of 10 years, had chosen to marry Lady Alina Winslow, and had done so within days of her public heartbreak. Invitations that had grown noticeably scarce since the ball began arriving again in greater numbers than before. Ladies who had avoided Alina's company in the days following her humiliation now sought her out at every gathering, eager to hear the details of her unexpected engagement directly from her own lips. Alina found the sudden reversal almost dizzying, though she was careful never to let her true feelings show. She answered every question with the same calm, measured grace the Duke himself seemed to embody, revealing little beyond the simple fact that she and the Duke had come to know one another, and had found in each other a match built on mutual respect. The formal signing of the betrothal contract took place at Ravensworth House, a grand but somewhat austere townhouse that Alina had passed many times without ever imagining she might one day call it home. The Duke's solicitor, a thin, precise man named Mr. Aldridge, laid out the terms of the agreement with careful attention, ensuring that Alina understood every provision before she was asked to sign. Her dowry, modest as it was, would be settled entirely upon her, to be used at her own discretion, rather than absorbed automatically into the Duke's larger estate. She would retain a personal allowance independent of any household expenses. And perhaps most surprising of all, a clause had been included granting her the right to maintain a private residence of her own choosing, separate from the Duke's primary estate, should she ever wish to make use of it. "This clause," Alina said, looking up from the document toward the Duke, who stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, "seems unusually generous, Your Grace." "I want you to understand from the very beginning," he said, "that this marriage does not bind you as a prisoner to my household. Should you ever find yourself unhappy, for whatever reason, I want you to know that you have somewhere else you might go, without needing my permission or my approval to do so." Alina considered his words carefully. It was, she realized, an unusual kindness, one that spoke to a deeper thoughtfulness than she had initially credited him with possessing. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not think many men would think to offer such a thing." "Many men," the Duke replied, "have not watched a woman lose everything she believed to be certain in the span of a single evening. I have no wish to see you trapped in circumstances that make you unhappy, Lady Alina, regardless of what our arrangement is called by society." The wedding date was set for 6 weeks hence, a timeline the Duke's family considered somewhat hasty, though no one dared to voice serious objection given the Duke's well-known aversion to prolonged social spectacle. Alina's mother threw herself into the preparations with an energy that suggested relief as much as excitement, relief that her elder daughter's future had been secured so unexpectedly, so favorably, after such a difficult beginning to the season. Alina's father, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in matters of courtship and marriage, took Alina aside one evening shortly after the betrothal contract had been signed. They sat together in his study, surrounded by his books and the familiar smell of pipe smoke that had always meant safety to Alina since childhood. "You do not have to do this," he said gently, "if it is not truly what you want. I know the circumstances that led you here were not kind ones, Alina, and I would not wish you to enter a marriage out of nothing more than a desire to escape your own embarrassment." "I know that, Papa," Alina said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant what she said next entirely. "But I have spoken with the Duke at length these past weeks. He has been honest with me in every conversation we have shared, more honest, I think, than Julian ever was, even in the months we spent planning our own wedding. I do not love him, not yet. But I believe I could grow to respect him deeply, and perhaps something more than respect, given time. That feels like a sturdier foundation to build a life upon than the kind of love that vanished the moment my sister smiled at him." Her father studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened. "Then I wish you every happiness, my dear, whatever shape that happiness takes." In the weeks that followed, Alina and the Duke saw one another with increasing frequency, always properly chaperoned, always within the bounds of propriety, but with a growing ease that surprised them both. He took her walking through the gardens at Ravensworth House, pointing out the plants his mother had once cultivated with great care before her passing. He asked after her interests, her opinions on matters of household management, her thoughts on books he had read and she had not, and books she had read and he had not, and seemed genuinely curious about her answers rather than merely performing polite interest. Alina, in turn, found herself curious about him as well, curious about the quiet reserve that seemed to guard something deeper beneath it, something he had not yet chosen to share with her. She did not press him, sensing instinctively that whatever lay behind his careful distance from society was not something to be pried loose before he was ready to offer it willingly. Julian and Margaret, meanwhile, had become the subject of their own set of whispers, though far less kind ones than those now surrounding Alina's engagement. Whatever passion had driven Julian to abandon his engagement so publicly seemed to have cooled rapidly once the scandal had run its course. And society, ever fickle in its sympathies, had begun to view the pair with suspicion rather than romantic admiration. Where once they might have been seen as star-crossed lovers who could not deny their feelings, they were increasingly seen instead as a man who had behaved dishonorably and a sister who had betrayed her own family, and the shine of their supposed romance had begun to tarnish accordingly. Alina heard news of this shift secondhand, through her mother's careful updates and the occasional comment dropped at social gatherings by women who seemed almost eager to share the details with her, as though offering her a small measure of justice for what she had endured. She found she took less satisfaction in it than she might have expected. Her anger toward Julian and Margaret had not entirely faded, but it had begun to feel distant, overshadowed by the growing complexity of her own new life and the man she was preparing to marry. One afternoon, several weeks into their engagement, Alina arrived at Ravensworth House for what had become a regular visit, only to find the Duke unusually distracted, his manner more guarded than she had grown accustomed to seeing. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" she asked, once they had settled into the drawing-room with her chaperone seated at a discreet distance near the window. He hesitated before answering, which was itself unusual, given how direct he had been with her in every previous conversation. "I received a letter this morning," he said finally, "from someone I had not expected to hear from again. It is not something I am prepared to discuss in detail, not yet. But I wanted you to know that if I seem preoccupied in the coming days, it is not a reflection of anything between us." Alina studied him carefully, sensing that whatever the letter contained touched on something deeper than mere business correspondence. "You do not owe me every detail of your life before you are ready to share it," she said. "But I hope you know that when you are ready, I am willing to listen." Something in his expression shifted at her words, something that looked almost like relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. "That means more to me than you may realize." They did not speak further of the letter that day, but Alina found herself thinking of it often in the days that followed, wondering what secret from the Duke's past might be waiting, quietly, at the edges of their carefully constructed arrangement, and whether it would remain hidden long enough for them to build something real between them before it emerged. The wedding day arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, the kind of crisp, golden morning that seemed almost too perfect for a marriage that had begun under such strange circumstances. Alina stood before the tall mirror in her mother's dressing room, watching her reflection as her maid fastened the final buttons of her gown, a deep ivory silk far more elegant than anything she had worn for her ill-fated engagement to Julian. She did not feel the nervous, fluttering excitement she had once imagined she would feel on her wedding day. What she felt instead was a strange, steady calm, the kind that comes not from certainty exactly, but from having made peace with a decision after careful thought rather than impulsive feeling. "You look beautiful," her mother said, coming to stand behind her, adjusting a stray curl near Alina's temple. "Are you frightened?" "A little," Alina admitted. "But not in the way I think you mean. I am not frightened of marrying him, Mama. I am frightened of everything that comes after, of building a life with someone I still barely know, of hoping that what I feel might grow into something real." Her mother met her eyes in the mirror. "Every marriage begins with some version of that fear, my dear, even the ones that begin with grand declarations of love, perhaps especially those. At least you enter this one with your eyes open, rather than blinded by promises that may or may not hold true." Alina thought of Julian then, briefly, and found that the thought no longer carried the same sharp sting it once had. It had faded, over the past weeks, into something smaller, something almost distant, replaced instead by a quiet curiosity about the man waiting for her at the church. The ceremony itself was small, by the standards of the city's grandest weddings, attended only by close family and a handful of the Duke's most trusted associates. Margaret was present, seated near the back of the church beside their aunt, her expression carefully neutral throughout the entire service. Julian did not attend, though Alina had not expected him to, and found she did not particularly care whether he had chosen to stay away out of respect or out of cowardice. When Alina walked down the narrow aisle on her father's arm, she found the Duke waiting for her at the altar, dressed in dark, formal attire that suited him far better than the extravagant fashions favored by so many of his peers. His expression, usually so carefully guarded, softened slightly as she approached, and for the first time since she had met him, Alina thought she glimpsed something warmer beneath his composed exterior. The vows themselves were traditional, the same words spoken at countless weddings throughout the city each season, but Alina found herself listening to them with unusual attention, weighing each promise as she spoke it, determined to mean every word rather than simply recite them out of obligation. When the ceremony concluded and they were pronounced husband and wife, the Duke, now fully her husband, leaned close and spoke words meant only for her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with this." "Thank you for asking," Alina replied, and found to her own surprise that she meant it entirely. The wedding breakfast that followed was a quiet, elegant affair, held in the gardens of Ravensworth House beneath a canopy of late autumn roses that had somehow, against the season, continued to bloom. Guests offered their congratulations, some with genuine warmth, others with the careful politeness of those still uncertain what to make of such an unexpected match. Alina moved through the gathering on her husband's arm, accepting well wishes with practiced grace, and found herself, for the first time in weeks, entirely unbothered by the whispers that inevitably followed wherever she went. Margaret approached her only once during the celebration, offering a stiff, formal congratulation that Alina accepted with equal formality, neither sister quite ready to bridge the distance that had opened between them since the ball. Alina watched her sister retreat afterward, watched the careful, brittle smile Margaret wore as she moved among the other guests, and wondered, not for the first time, whether Margaret's choice had brought her the happiness she had clearly hoped it would. It was late in the afternoon when Alina finally found herself alone with her new husband, the two of them walking together through the quieter paths of the garden, away from the remaining guests, the noise of the celebration fading gently behind them. "You handled today remarkably well," the Duke said, glancing at her sideways as they walked. "I imagine it cannot have been easy, marrying beneath such scrutiny, with your family and hers both watching so closely." "I have had practice these past weeks learning to hold myself steady beneath scrutiny," Alina said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips. "Though I confess today felt different, less like enduring something and more like beginning something." The Duke was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "I hope that feeling remains true as the days ahead unfold. I know this marriage began under unusual circumstances, Alina, and I know I cannot promise you the kind of romance you might have once imagined for yourself. But I intend to keep every promise I have made to you, starting today." "I believe you," Alina said, and realized as she spoke the words that she meant them with a certainty that surprised her. They settled into their shared life at Ravensworth House in the weeks that followed, establishing routines that felt, gradually, less like the careful negotiations of strangers, and more like the comfortable rhythms of two people building something together. Alina took an active interest in managing the household, working alongside the Duke's longtime housekeeper to understand the running of such a large estate, and found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that her husband valued her opinions on matters both large and small, consulting her rather than simply informing her of decisions already made. In the evenings, they often sat together in the library, Alina with a book in her lap, the Duke reviewing correspondence from his various estates, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Occasionally, he would read something aloud that struck him as interesting, and Alina would offer her thoughts, and slowly, gradually, conversation began to flow between them with an ease neither had quite expected when their arrangement first began. It was during one such evening, several weeks into their marriage, that Alina finally worked up the courage to ask about the letter he had received before their wedding, the one he had promised to explain when he was ready. "You said before we married that you would tell me about the letter you received when you were ready," she said carefully, setting her book aside. "I do not wish to press you if the time is not right. But I find myself curious, and I would rather ask you directly than continue wondering in silence." The Duke set down the papers he had been reviewing and was quiet for a long moment, his expression turning thoughtful, distant, touched with something that looked almost like old pain carefully contained. "The letter was from a woman named Charlotte Byron," he said finally. "Many years ago, before you knew me, before society knew me as the reclusive Duke you have heard rumors about, I was engaged to be married to her. We were young, and I believed myself deeply in love, and I believed she felt the same." Alina listened carefully, sensing that this was the source of the guarded distance she had noticed in him from their very first conversation. "She left me, 3 weeks before our wedding, for a man with a larger fortune and a more prominent title," the Duke continued. "I did not learn of it from her directly. I learned of it the way you learned of Julian and your sister, through whispers and stares at a gathering I had not expected to become the subject of scandal. I spent the following years avoiding society almost entirely, convinced that any attempt at genuine connection would end the same way." "And the letter?" Alina asked gently. "Her marriage ended badly some years ago, and she has recently returned to the city," he said. "The letter informed me of her return and expressed a wish to speak with me, to explain herself after all these years. I have not yet decided how or whether to respond." Alina considered this carefully, weighing her own feelings before she spoke. "Do you still have feelings for her?" "No," the Duke said, and something in the firmness of his answer convinced her he meant it entirely. "Whatever I once felt for her died a long time ago, buried beneath years of careful distance from anything resembling that kind of vulnerability. But her return has stirred old memories I had thought long settled, and I did not wish to keep that from you, given how our own marriage began under similarly difficult circumstances." "Thank you for telling me," Alina said quietly. "I understand now, better than before, why you offered me the arrangement you did that night in the garden. You recognized something in my situation that mirrored your own." "Perhaps I did," the Duke admitted, "though I did not fully realize it myself until this very conversation." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and Alina found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, for the honesty her husband had chosen to offer her, even when the truth clearly cost him something to share. Whatever shadow Charlotte Byron's return might cast over their marriage in the days ahead, Alina felt certain, for the first time since their wedding, that she and her husband were building something sturdy enough to withstand it. Winter settled over the city slowly, frost creeping across the windows of Ravensworth House each morning, and with it came a quiet rhythm to Alina's new life that she had not anticipated finding so easily. The early awkwardness of their arrangement had softened into something steadier, something that felt, on most days, remarkably like genuine partnership. Alina had thrown herself into learning the full scope of managing such a large household, and found she had a talent for it that pleased her more than she expected. She reorganized the estate's accounts with the help of the Duke's steward, streamlining expenses that had gone unchecked for years under the previous housekeeper's less rigorous oversight. She oversaw the planning of small gatherings, dinners for the Duke's business associates and occasional visits from distant family members, and found that she enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of running a household well, of being trusted with responsibilities that mattered. The Duke, for his part, seemed to notice and appreciate every effort she made, offering praise where it was due, and consulting her opinion on matters he might once have handled entirely alone. Alina began to look forward to their evenings together in the library, the quiet comfort of shared silence broken occasionally by conversation that had grown, over the weeks, increasingly personal, increasingly warm. One particularly cold evening in late November, Alina found the Duke standing near the window of the library, staring out at the frost-covered gardens with an expression of unusual melancholy. She approached quietly, settling into the chair beside him rather than her usual spot across the room. "You seem troubled tonight," she observed. He turned to look at her, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered across his features before he composed himself again. "It is the anniversary of my mother's passing," he said. "She died 6 years ago this week. I do not often speak of her, but tonight, for whatever reason, I find myself thinking of her more than usual." "Tell me about her," Elinor said softly. "If you would like to." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and Elinor wondered if she had overstepped. If this was a wound he preferred to keep private, tended only in solitude. But then he began to speak, slowly at first, and then with growing warmth, describing a woman who had been, by his account, fiercely intelligent and warmly affectionate in equal measure. A duchess who had run Ravensworth House with a firm but gentle hand, who had taught him everything he knew about managing an estate and treating the people within it with fairness and respect. "She would have liked you," he said finally, his voice softer than Elinor had ever heard it. "She valued strength of character above nearly everything else, and she despised pretense of any kind. I think she would have seen in you exactly what I saw, that night in the garden." Elinor felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, an unfamiliar feeling she was only beginning to recognize as genuine affection rather than mere respect. "I wish I could have known her," she said quietly. "It sounds as though she shaped you into the man you are, in ways that go far deeper than most people realize, given how little you reveal of yourself to the world." "I have revealed more to you, these past weeks, than I have to nearly anyone since her passing," the Duke admitted. "I am not entirely certain why, except that you have never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am." "Why would I ask that of you?" Elinor said. "I entered this marriage weary of pretense myself. I have no wish to build a life with someone performing a role, rather than simply being who they truly are." The Duke reached out then, hesitantly, and took her hand in his, a gesture that surprised them both with its simple sincerity. "Elinor," he said, "I did not expect, when I made you that offer in the garden, to find myself caring for you the way I find myself caring for you now. I promised you honesty, and so I will not pretend this feeling has not grown into something I did not anticipate when we began." Elinor's heart quickened at his words, and she found herself searching his face carefully, looking for any sign of insincerity and finding none, only the same steady honesty he had shown her from their very first conversation. "I have found myself feeling the same," she admitted quietly. "I did not expect it either. I entered this marriage believing I had already given whatever capacity I had for love to someone who did not value it, but these past weeks with you have taught me that perhaps I was wrong to believe that." They sat together in the quiet library long after that conversation, the fire burning low, neither of them speaking further, content simply to sit together in a silence that had transformed, somewhere along the way, from the careful distance of strangers into the comfortable closeness of two people who had begun, genuinely, to fall in love. In the weeks that followed, their relationship deepened steadily. The Duke, whom Elinor had begun, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to call Sebastian rather than by his title, began accompanying her more frequently on her errands through the city, walking beside her through the markets and shops with an ease that would have seemed impossible when their marriage first began. They attended social gatherings together, and Elinor noticed, with quiet pleasure, that Sebastian seemed less guarded in public than he had been before their marriage, more willing to engage in conversation, more visibly comfortable in her company. Society took note of the change as well. Where once the Duke of Ravensworth had been known primarily for his cold reserve, whispers now began to circulate suggesting that his marriage had softened him considerably, that Lady Elinor, as she was still sometimes called despite her new title, had succeeded where so many other women had failed, in drawing genuine warmth from a man who had spent a decade guarding himself against exactly that kind of vulnerability. Elinor's mother visited often during these months, delighted by the evident happiness her daughter had found, though she was careful never to speak too directly of it, wary of disturbing whatever fragile, growing thing had taken root between Elinor and her husband. Elinor's father, too, seemed pleased whenever he called upon the couple, though his pleasure expressed itself mostly through quiet, satisfied observation rather than any direct comment. Margaret, however, remained noticeably absent from these gatherings, and Alina found herself thinking of her sister more often than she expected, wondering how Margaret's own relationship with Julian had fared in the months since the scandal that had begun everything. She heard occasional updates, second-hand, through mutual acquaintances who seemed to delight in reporting the details to her. Julian and Margaret had become formally engaged shortly after Alina's own wedding, though the engagement had proceeded with far less fanfare than Alina's had, society's attention having largely moved on to other, fresher scandals by that point. One afternoon in early December, as Alina sat in the drawing room reviewing household accounts, a servant announced an unexpected visitor. Alina looked up, startled, to find her sister standing in the doorway, dressed in a fine but somewhat severe gown that did little to hide the evident strain in her expression. "Margaret," Alina said, setting aside her papers and rising slowly, "I did not expect to see you today." "I know," Margaret said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar tremor. "I would not have come, except that I did not know where else to turn." Alina studied her sister carefully, noting the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands twisted anxiously in the fabric of her skirt. Whatever had brought Margaret here today, it was clear she was deeply troubled. "Sit down," Alina said finally, gesturing toward the chair across from her own. "Tell me what has happened." Margaret sat, her composure fraying visibly now that she was no longer standing beneath the weight of formal politeness. "Julian and I," she began, and then stopped, pressing her lips together as though searching for the courage to continue. "Our engagement is not what I believed it would be, Alina. He has grown distant these past weeks, cold in ways he was never cold with me before, back when we first began, when everything felt so certain." Alina felt a complicated tangle of emotions rise within her, sympathy warring with the lingering hurt she had never fully released, curiosity warring with a wariness born of everything that had happened between them. "What do you mean, distant?" "He spends less time with me than he once did," Margaret said. "He speaks of our future together with less enthusiasm, and when I press him on it, he grows irritated, tells me I am imagining things that are not there. But I am not imagining it, Alina. Something has changed in him, and I do not know what I did to cause it." Alina was quiet for a long moment, choosing her next words carefully. "Margaret, I do not say this to hurt you, but you must understand how strange it feels for me, to sit here and comfort you over the very man whose affection you took from me, only months ago." Margaret flinched and tears welled in her eyes, though she did not look away. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I have no right to ask this of you, but you are the only person I can speak to honestly about this, Alina. Our mother would only worry, and our father would only grow angry with Julian, and I do not know who else to turn to." Alina considered her sister's distress, weighing her own lingering resentment against the simple fact that Margaret was, whatever had happened between them, still her sister, and clearly suffering in ways that could not be entirely dismissed. "I cannot tell you what has changed in Julian's heart," Alina said finally. "I do not know the man well enough anymore to guess at his motivations, but I will tell you this, Margaret. If he treated me the way you describe him treating you now, distant and irritable and dismissive of your concerns, then perhaps the fault does not lie entirely with you. Perhaps it lies with a man who does not know how to sustain affection once the excitement of a new pursuit has faded." Margaret absorbed this in silence, her expression torn between hurt and something that looked almost like grim recognition. "You believe he will grow tired of me, the way he grew tired of you." "I do not know what will happen between you and Julian," Alina said carefully. "But I would ask you to consider, honestly, whether the affection he showed you at the beginning was built on something real, or on the same kind of fleeting excitement that led him away from our engagement so easily. A man capable of abandoning one commitment so readily may not be a man capable of sustaining another, however differently it may have begun." Margaret left shortly after that conversation, her expression thoughtful and troubled in equal measure, and Alina sat alone in the drawing room for a long while afterward, considering the strange turn their conversation had taken. She had expected, if her sister ever came to her in distress, to feel some measure of satisfaction, some quiet vindication for the pain she herself had endured. Instead, she found only a complicated sadness, a recognition that whatever had happened between them, she did not wish to see her sister genuinely suffer, even now. When Sebastian returned home that evening and asked about her unusually pensive mood, Alina told him of Margaret's visit, and found, as she spoke, that she trusted him completely with the complicated tangle of feelings the encounter had stirred within her. "You are a better woman than I might have been in your position," Sebastian said, once she had finished. "I am not certain I could have offered comfort so freely to someone who caused me such pain." "I am not entirely certain I offered comfort," Alina admitted. "I told her a hard truth rather than a kind lie, but perhaps that is its own kind of comfort in the end. Better she hear it from someone honest than continue believing something false simply, because it is easier to bear." Sebastian reached for her hand, the gesture now familiar and welcome between them, and Alina found herself grateful once again for the strange, unexpected path that had led her to this quiet library, this steady man, this life she had never imagined choosing for herself, and yet had come, gradually and genuinely, to cherish. Christmas came and went at Ravensworth House, celebrated quietly with Alina's parents and a small circle of close friends. And by the turn of the new year, Alina found herself settled into her marriage with a contentment she had never imagined possible in the aftermath of Julian's betrayal. She and Sebastian had grown closer still, their conversations stretching later into the evenings, their shared responsibilities managing the estate deepening into genuine partnership rather than mere practical arrangement. It was in the second week of January that Margaret returned to Ravensworth House, this time in a state of visible distress that immediately alarmed the household staff who announced her arrival. Alina hurried to the drawing room to find her sister in tears, her traveling cloak still fastened, as though she had left her own home in such haste she had not paused to remove it. "Margaret, what has happened?" Alina asked, guiding her sister to sit near the fire. It took several minutes before Margaret could speak clearly through her distress. When the words finally came, they arrived in a rush, tumbling over one another as though she could not contain them any longer. "Julian has ended our engagement," Margaret said. "This morning, without warning, without any explanation beyond claiming that his feelings had changed. He gave me no chance to understand what I had done wrong, no chance to fix whatever had gone amiss between us. He simply informed me it was over and left." Alina felt a complicated wave of emotion at this news, an unwelcome flicker of vindication quickly overtaken by genuine concern for her sister's evident suffering. Whatever satisfaction she might once have imagined feeling at this moment, faced with the reality of Margaret's tears, she found she could summon only sympathy. "I am so sorry, Margaret," she said, and meant it. "This must be devastating for you." "It is worse than devastating," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "Alina, I fear I am with child." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unexpected, and Alina felt her breath catch. She reached for her sister's hand instinctively, understanding immediately the full weight of what Margaret now faced. An engagement broken was one thing, survivable with enough time and enough discretion. A child born outside of marriage was another matter entirely, one that could destroy not only Margaret's reputation, but the standing of their entire family. "Does Julian know?" Alina asked carefully. "I told him this morning before he ended things," Margaret said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I thought foolishly that it might make him more eager to proceed with our marriage quickly, rather than less. Instead, he grew cold, colder than I had ever seen him, and told me the situation was mine to manage, that he could not be certain the child was even his." Alina's stomach turned at the cruelty of this response. Any lingering resentment toward Margaret momentarily forgot in the face of Julian's evident cowardice. Whatever fault her sister bore in the events that had begun this whole difficult chain of circumstances, she did not deserve to be abandoned so callously in her moment of greatest vulnerability. "He is lying," Alina said firmly. "Whatever his reasons for saying such a thing, he knows it is not true, and he says it only to escape his own responsibility." "I know," Margaret whispered, "but knowing it does not change what I now face, Alina. I do not know what I am to do. Mother and father will be devastated. Society will be merciless. I do not know how I am to survive what is coming." Elinor sat with her sister for a long while, holding her hand, offering what comfort she could while her mind raced through the difficult reality of the situation. Whatever her own feelings about Margaret's past actions, she could not, in good conscience, turn her back on her sister now, not when the consequences facing her were so severe, so potentially devastating to her entire future. When Sebastian returned home later that evening and learned of the situation, Elinor watched carefully for his reaction, uncertain how he might respond to such a scandal touching so closely upon their own family. To her relief and her growing admiration, his response was neither judgment nor dismissal, but immediate, practical concern. "We must think carefully about how to protect her," he said, once Margaret had been settled in a guest room to rest, her exhaustion finally overtaking her distress. "Society will show her little mercy if this becomes known before some solution can be arranged." "What solution could there possibly be?" Elinor asked, pacing the length of the library in her worry. "Julian refuses to acknowledge his responsibility, and even if he were forced to marry her, I do not know that Margaret would find any happiness in binding herself to a man who has shown himself so willing to abandon her at the first sign of difficulty." Sebastian considered this carefully. There are other paths available to her, beyond forcing an unwilling man into marriage. Your sister could travel, perhaps to visit distant relatives, for an extended period, allowing time and distance to obscure the details of her situation from society's attention. It is not an easy path, nor a comfortable one, but it is a path that has protected other women in similar circumstances. Elinor considered this possibility, weighing its difficulties against the alternative of allowing Margaret's reputation, and by extension their entire family's standing, to be destroyed by scandal. "I have an aunt, my mother's sister, who lives quietly in the countryside, some distance from the city. She has always been fond of Margaret and myself, and I believe she would offer her hospitality if I wrote to explain the circumstances discreetly." "Then that seems a wise first step," Sebastian said. "I can provide whatever financial assistance might be necessary to make the arrangement comfortable for your sister, without drawing attention to its purpose." Elinor looked at her husband with fresh gratitude, moved by his willingness to extend such generosity toward a woman who had, only months earlier, caused Elinor such profound pain. "You do not have to involve yourself in this, Sebastian. Margaret's troubles are not truly your concern." "Your family's concerns are my concerns now, Elinor," he said simply. "Whatever difficulties Margaret's choices have caused you in the past, I do not believe in allowing a woman to suffer alone through consequences that were not entirely of her own making. Julian bears equal responsibility in this matter, and it is a great injustice that society will place the entire burden upon her shoulders while he escapes largely unscathed." Elinor felt tears prick at her own eyes, moved by the depth of compassion her husband continued to reveal, layer by layer, as their marriage progressed. She crossed the room and embraced him, grateful beyond words for the steady, generous man she had somehow, against all expectation, come to love so completely. The following morning, Elinor sat with Margaret and carefully laid out the plan Sebastian had proposed. Margaret, still fragile from the previous day's distress, listened with a mixture of relief and lingering shame. "I do not deserve your kindness, Elinor, or the Duke's," she said quietly, once Elinor had finished explaining. "After everything I did to you, I have no right to ask for your help now." "You did not ask," Elinor said gently. "I am offering it freely because whatever has happened between us, you are still my sister, and I have no wish to see you destroyed by a man who never deserved either of our affections in the first place." Margaret's tears returned, though these seemed born of gratitude rather than despair. "I have thought often, these past months, about the things I said to you when you told me of your engagement to the Duke. I was jealous, Elinor, jealous that you had found such an unexpected, remarkable match, when my own choice had already begun to reveal its flaws. I am ashamed of that jealousy now, more ashamed than I know how to properly express. Perhaps we can speak more of that in time, Elinor said. For now, let us focus on securing your safety and your future. There will be time enough later to mend what remains broken between us. Arrangements proceeded quickly in the days that followed. Elinor wrote to her aunt, explaining the situation with careful discretion, and received a warm, welcoming reply within days, expressing genuine happiness at the prospect of Margaret's extended visit. Sebastian quietly arranged for a generous allowance to accompany her, ensuring she would want for nothing during her time away from the city. Their parents, when informed of the full situation, reacted with the shock and distress Margaret had feared, though their anger, once the initial shock had passed, settled far more heavily upon Julian than upon their younger daughter. Their father, in particular, expressed a cold fury toward Julian that Elinor had rarely witnessed in her normally mild-mannered parent, and spoke seriously of confronting the man directly regarding his responsibilities, though cooler heads eventually prevailed, recognizing that such a confrontation would likely only draw further attention to the very scandal they sought to avoid. Margaret departed for the countryside in early February, her carriage pulling away from the Winslow townhouse in the gray, quiet light of an early winter morning. Elinor stood beside her parents to see her off, and as the carriage disappeared around the corner, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that her sister would be spared the worst of society's judgment, sorrow at the distance now separating them, however necessary that distance had become. "You have been remarkably generous to her," Elinor said to Sebastian that evening, as they sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly against the winter chill. "More generous than I think I could have managed if our positions were reversed. I do not believe kindness should be reserved only for those who have never wronged us," Sebastian said. "Your sister made a grave mistake, and she is paying for it dearly. I see no virtue in adding to her suffering when compassion might instead offer her a path forward." Elinor studied her husband's face in the firelight, marveling once again at the depth of character she had discovered beneath his initially guarded exterior. "I love you," she said quietly, the words emerging with a simple, unguarded honesty that surprised even herself. "I do not think I have said it plainly before, though I believe I have felt it growing within me for some weeks now." Sebastian's expression softened into something Elinor had never seen from him before, a warmth so complete it seemed to transform his entire face. "I love you as well, Elinor," he said. "More completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone, after everything that happened with Charlotte all those years ago. You have taught me that trust, once broken, can still be rebuilt, if one is fortunate enough to find the right person willing to help rebuild it." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the quiet declaration settling between them like a promise finally spoken aloud. And Elinor found herself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever pain had brought her to this marriage, she would not now trade the life she had built with Sebastian for anything the world might have offered her instead. The peace Elinor and Sebastian had found together did not last undisturbed for long. In the early days of March, a card arrived at Ravensworth House, requesting a meeting between the Duke and a woman whose name Elinor recognized immediately, having heard it only once before, spoken quietly in the library on a cold winter evening. Charlotte Byron, now widowed and recently returned to the city, wished to call upon the Duke, and had written directly to him rather than approaching through any intermediary. Sebastian showed Elinor the letter without hesitation, a gesture that spoke to the trust that had grown steadily between them since their marriage began. "I do not wish to see her," he said, setting the letter aside. "Whatever she believes she owes me by way of explanation, I have no need of it now. I have built a life I value far more than anything we once shared." "Perhaps," Elinor said slowly, considering the matter carefully, "it would be wiser to see her regardless. Unresolved matters have a way of resurfacing at the least convenient moments, Sebastian. If you refuse to see her now, she may seek other ways to gain your attention, ways that could prove more disruptive to the life we have built together." Sebastian studied his wife with evident surprise. "You would not object if I agreed to meet with her?" "I trust you," Elinor said simply. And I would rather you face this matter directly, with my knowledge and my support, than have it hang over us indefinitely, unresolved and uncertain. Sebastian agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to a brief meeting, arranged at his own townhouse rather than any neutral location, and insisted, despite Charlotte's evident surprise at the request, that Alina be present throughout the entire conversation. Charlotte Byon arrived precisely on time, a striking woman whose beauty had clearly not faded despite the years and evident hardships that had followed her broken engagement to Sebastian. She entered the drawing room with a composed, careful grace, though Alina noted the slight widening of her eyes when she saw Alina seated beside the Duke, clearly present for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, offering a formal curtsy. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, and this must be your wife, whom I have heard so much about since my return to the city." "Lady Alina," Sebastian said, gesturing toward his wife with quiet pride evident in his voice. "My wife has my full trust, and I have asked her to remain present for whatever you wish to discuss." Charlotte's composure faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, settling into the chair offered to her. "I see," she said. "Then I suppose I shall speak plainly, rather than dance around the matter with any pretense of privacy." She proceeded to explain the circumstances of her departure so many years ago, describing a young woman pressured relentlessly by her own family to secure the more advantageous match, despite her genuine affection for Sebastian at the time. Her marriage, she admitted, had proven unhappy, her husband cold and frequently absent, and his recent death had left her with a modest inheritance but little genuine comfort or security. "I did not return to the city seeking to disrupt your life, Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice growing softer, more genuinely emotional as she continued. "I returned because I had nowhere else to go, and I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that enough time had passed for us to speak honestly about what happened between us, without the anger that once separated us so completely." Sebastian listened to her explanation with careful attention, though Alina noted that his expression remained steady, guarded, but not unkind. "I appreciate your honesty, Charlotte," he said finally, "and I do not harbor the anger I once felt toward you. Time and other circumstances have allowed me to release that particular burden, but I must be equally honest with you in return. Whatever we once shared belongs firmly to the past. I have built a new life now, one I value completely, and I have no wish to revisit old feelings that no longer have any place within it." Charlotte's eyes flickered briefly toward Alina before returning to Sebastian. "I understand," she said, though something in her tone suggested she had hoped for a different response. "I only wished for the chance to explain myself, after all this time, and to offer my apology for the pain I caused you so many years ago." "Your apology is accepted," Sebastian said, "and I wish you well in whatever life you choose to build going forward. But I must ask that you not seek further contact beyond this conversation, Charlotte. My wife and I have a life together now that I have no wish to see disturbed by matters that belong firmly to the past." Charlotte accepted this with visible disappointment, though she maintained her composure as she rose to take her leave, offering a final formal curtsy before departing the room. Alina watched her go, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt more sympathy than jealousy toward the woman who had once broken her husband's heart so completely. "You handled that with great composure," Alina said, once Charlotte had departed and they were alone once more. "I could not have handled it half so well without you beside me," Sebastian said, reaching for her hand. "Your presence reminded me, throughout the entire conversation, of exactly what I stand to lose if I allow old wounds to distract me from the life we have built together." Alina smiled, though a small, lingering worry remained in the back of her mind. "Do you believe she will honor your request and stay away going forward?" "I do not know," Sebastian admitted honestly. "But whatever she chooses to do, it changes nothing about my feelings for you, Alina. You need never doubt that." Despite his reassurances, Charlotte's presence in the city continued to cast a subtle shadow over the following weeks. Alina began to notice her occasionally at social gatherings, always maintaining a careful distance. though her eyes frequently found Sebastian across crowded rooms with an intensity that made Alina's stomach tighten with unwelcome unease. Whispers began to circulate as well, speculation about the old connection between the Duke and the recently widowed Mrs. Byron, speculation that Alina found herself forced to endure with careful, practiced composure, much as she had once endured the whispers surrounding her broken engagement to Julian. Matters came to a difficult head at a large gathering hosted by one of Sebastian's oldest associates, an event neither Alina nor Sebastian could easily avoid given the importance of the host's friendship to Sebastian's various business interests. Charlotte was present as well, and midway through the evening, while Sebastian had stepped away briefly to discuss business matters with several other gentlemen, Charlotte approached Alina directly, her expression carefully composed but her words carrying an edge Alina had not expected. "You must forgive me for speaking so directly, Lady Alina," Charlotte said, "but I feel I owe you some explanation, given the circumstances of our first meeting. Sebastian and I shared something once that I do not believe has entirely faded, whatever he may have told you to the contrary." Alina felt her composure tighten, though she kept her voice steady. "My husband has been entirely honest with me about your history together, Mrs. Byron. I have no doubts about where his feelings currently lie." "Perhaps not doubts," Charlotte said, her tone growing softer, almost pitying. "But I wonder if you have considered how difficult it must be for a man to fully release feelings that once ran so deep, however much time has passed. I do not say this to cause you pain, Lady Alina, only to offer you the honesty I believe you deserve." Alina studied the other woman carefully, recognizing, beneath the carefully wrapped words, an attempt to plant seeds of doubt that had no true foundation in reality. "I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Byron," she said evenly, "though I must tell you that my confidence in my husband's feelings does not rest on assumptions about what he has or has not fully released from his past. It rests on the honest conversations we have shared and the life we have built together since our marriage began. I would ask that you not seek to disturb that foundation further, for your own sake as much as mine." Charlotte's expression shifted, something like genuine surprise crossing her features at Alina's steady, unshaken response. "You are more formidable than I anticipated," she said finally, something almost like reluctant respect entering her voice. "I have learned this past year that formidable is often required of women who wish to protect what matters most to them," Alina said simply. When Sebastian returned and noticed the tension still lingering in the air between the two women, Alina recounted the conversation honestly, refusing to hide any detail from him despite the discomfort it had caused her. "I am sorry she approached you that way," Sebastian said, his expression darkening with evident frustration. "I will speak with her directly and make certain she understands beyond any doubt that such behavior will not be tolerated going forward." "You need not confront her further on my account," Alina said. "I handled the conversation well enough on my own, and I believe she understood my meaning clearly by the time it concluded." "Nonetheless," Sebastian said, "I will not allow her presence to become a continued source of distress for you, Alina. Whatever history exists between us, my loyalty belongs entirely to you now, and I intend to make certain that fact remains beyond any reasonable doubt, for anyone who might seek to suggest otherwise." True to his word, Sebastian sought a private conversation with Charlotte in the days that followed, making clear, in terms that left no room for further misunderstanding, that any continued attempts to insert herself into his marriage would not be welcomed, regardless of whatever lingering feelings she might still harbor from their shared past. Charlotte, whether from genuine understanding or simple recognition of the futility of her efforts, largely withdrew from the social circles Alina and Sebastian frequented in the months that followed, and the whispers surrounding their supposed old connection gradually faded as newer scandals captured society's fickle attention instead. Alina found, in the aftermath of this difficult chapter, that her marriage had emerged not weakened but strengthened, tested by genuine adversity and proven sturdy enough to withstand it. Whatever doubts Charlotte's return had briefly stirred within her had been thoroughly settled by Sebastian's steady, unwavering demonstration of commitment, and Alina found herself trusting him more completely than she had ever believed possible, given how their marriage had begun. Spring arrived gently that year, and with it came news from the countryside that lifted a weight from Alina's heart she had carried quietly since her sister's departure months before. Margaret had given birth to a healthy daughter in early April, and their aunt's letters described a young mother finding unexpected strength and purpose in her new role, far removed from the judgment and scandal that would have surely followed her in the city. Alina traveled to visit her sister shortly after receiving this news, accompanied by Sebastian, who insisted on making the journey despite the demands of managing his estates closer to the city. The reunion between the sisters was tearful and tender, all the old distance between them finally beginning to dissolve in the face of Margaret's evident joy in her small daughter, whom she had named Rose. "She is beautiful," Alina said, holding her small niece carefully in her arms, marveling at the tiny fingers curling instinctively around her own. "She is the best thing to come from this entire difficult year," Margaret said, watching Alina with her daughter, her own eyes bright with tears. "I do not know what I would have done, Alina, without your help and the Duke's generosity. You saved us both, truly, when I had nowhere else to turn." "You are my sister," Alina said simply. "Whatever difficulties came between us, that fact never truly changed." Margaret reached for Alina's hand, squeezing it gently. "I hope, someday, I might be able to repay the kindness you and Sebastian have shown me. I know I do not deserve such generosity, not after everything I did to hurt you." "We have both grown this past year," Alina said. "I no longer carry the anger I once felt toward you, Margaret. What happened between us led me, however painfully, to a life I would not trade for anything, a marriage built on genuine love with a man I might never have known otherwise. I cannot regret a path that led me here, even if the beginning of that path was difficult beyond measure." Sebastian, who had been discussing estate matters with Margaret's husband in the neighboring room, entered shortly after and greeted his small niece with a warmth that surprised Margaret, given the awkward circumstances that had once connected their families. "She has strong lungs," he observed, as baby Rose began to fuss softly in Alina's arms. "A good sign, I am told, for a healthy future." Margaret laughed, the sound genuine and unburdened in a way Alina had not heard from her sister in many months. "You have both given us far more than we deserved," she said. "I only hope, someday, to find happiness of my own, even if it looks different than I once imagined it would." Their aunt, watching the reunion with evident satisfaction, mentioned quietly to Alina later that a widowed gentleman farmer in the neighboring county had begun calling upon Margaret with increasing frequency, drawn by her evident kindness and quiet resilience despite the circumstances of her daughter's birth. Whether that particular connection would flourish into something lasting remained to be seen, but Alina found herself hopeful, genuinely hopeful, that her sister might yet build a life of her own happiness, however different it looked from the path either of them had originally imagined for themselves. The journey back to the city passed in comfortable, reflective silence, Alina watching the countryside roll past the carriage window, her hand resting comfortably in Sebastian's. "You seem at peace," Sebastian observed, studying her expression. "I am," Alina said, and found the words entirely true. "I think, for the first time since that terrible night at the ball, I have finally released the last of the anger I carried toward Margaret and toward Julian as well, for that matter. Whatever pain their choices caused me, it led me to you, and to a life I value more than I ever imagined possible." "I confess," Sebastian said, "I sometimes wonder what might have become of me had you refused my offer that night in the garden. I do not think I would have found the courage to make such an offer to anyone else, given how thoroughly I had convinced myself that marriage held nothing worthwhile for a man who had already been burned once by love. Then I suppose we owe our happiness, in some strange way, to Julian's poor judgment and my sister's momentary weakness," Alina said, a wry smile touching her lips. though I do not think either of them intended to give us such a gift when they set that terrible chain of events into motion. Sebastian laughed, a rare, genuine sound that Alina had grown to treasure over the months of their marriage. No, I do not imagine they did. But perhaps that is often how the best things arrive in our lives, Alina, unexpected and unplanned, born from circumstances we would never have chosen for ourselves, and yet leading us, eventually, exactly where we were always meant to be. They returned to Ravensworth House in late spring, settling back into the familiar, comfortable rhythms of their shared life together, though something between them had deepened further still, strengthened by the trials of the past year, by Charlotte's brief, unsettling return, by Margaret's difficult journey and its ultimately hopeful resolution. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Sebastian surprised Alina with a small, private celebration in the same garden where he had first made his unusual proposal. The willow tree now heavy with summer leaves rather than bare against the autumn chill of that fateful night a year before. "I wanted to bring you back here," he said, as they stood together beneath the willow's shade, "to remind us both of where this journey truly began. I did not know that night what our marriage would become. I offered you protection and practicality, believing that was the most either of us could reasonably hope for, given the circumstances that brought us together." "And now," Alina asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it plainly in the warmth of his expression. "Now I know that what began as a practical arrangement has become the truest, deepest love I have ever known," Sebastian said. "I did not choose you for love, Alina, that first night. But I have chosen you every single day since, and I will continue choosing you for the rest of our lives together, with a devotion I did not believe myself capable of feeling before I came to know you fully." Alina felt tears gather in her eyes, happy tears this time, entirely unlike the ones she had shed in this very garden a year before. "I love you, Sebastian," she said, "more completely than I ever believed love could exist, after everything Julian's betrayal taught me to doubt about its very nature. You have shown me that love built slowly, on honesty and respect and genuine partnership, can grow into something far sturdier and more precious than the fleeting passion I once mistook for it." They stood together beneath the willow tree as the summer evening settled softly around them, and Alina found herself thinking, not for the first time, of how strange and unexpected the paths of one's life could prove to be. A single terrible evening, a betrayal she could never have anticipated, had led her, through grief and uncertainty and careful, deliberate choice, to a happiness far deeper and more genuine than she had ever imagined possible. Whatever whispers had once followed her through crowded ballrooms, whatever pity or scorn had once been directed her way, all of it had faded now, replaced by the quiet, steady contentment of a life well built, a partnership genuinely earned rather than merely inherited by circumstance. Alina Winslow, who had once stood humiliated and heartbroken in a garden much like this one, had become instead the Duchess of Ravensworth, a woman who had learned, through hardship, exactly what kind of love was truly worth having, and exactly what kind of strength it took to build it deliberately and honestly from the ground up. As the sun set fully behind the garden hedges and the first stars began to emerge overhead, Sebastian drew her close, and Alina rested her head against his shoulder, feeling more completely than she ever had before that she had finally found not just a marriage, but a true and lasting home. 5 years passed, and the city that had once buzzed with whispers about a jilted bride and an unexpected duke had long since moved its attention to newer scandals, newer gossip, newer season's darlings and disgraces. Alina, now fully accustomed to her role as Duchess of Ravensworth, walked through the halls of her home one bright spring morning with a toddler balanced on her hip, a boy with his father's serious dark eyes and his mother's quick, curious smile. Their son, named Henry after Sebastian's late father, had been born 2 years into their marriage, followed a year later by a daughter, Charlotte, a name Alina had chosen deliberately, quietly, as a private acknowledgement that even old wounds could be transformed into something that no longer carried any sting. Sebastian had raised an eyebrow when she first suggested the name, but had agreed readily enough, understanding the gesture for what it was, a final release of any lingering shadow from his past. Life at Ravensworth House had settled into a rhythm of genuine happiness, punctuated by the ordinary chaos of raising young children, managing a large household, and maintaining the social obligations that came with their rank. Elinor had grown skilled over the years at balancing all these demands with the same quiet competence she had first demonstrated in the earliest months of her marriage, and Sebastian continued to rely on her judgment in matters both domestic and financial, their partnership having only deepened with time. Margaret's life, too, had continued along its own hopeful trajectory. The gentleman farmer who had begun courting her in the countryside had eventually proposed, and Margaret had accepted, finding in him a steadiness and genuine devotion that Julian had never truly offered her. They had settled into a comfortable, unpretentious life in the countryside, raising Rose alongside two younger children born of their own marriage, and Margaret wrote to Elinor frequently, letters full of warmth and genuine affection that had gradually healed whatever remained of the old wounds between the sisters. They visited each other twice yearly now, gatherings that had become cherished traditions for both families, the children growing up as cousins despite the physical distance between their homes, Rose in particular forming a close bond with young Henry that made both mothers smile with quiet satisfaction whenever they watched the children play together in the gardens. Julian, by contrast, had faded largely from Elinor's awareness over the years, his name surfacing only occasionally in second-hand gossip that suggested a life of diminishing fortune and increasing isolation. He had never married, as far as Elinor knew, his reputation having suffered lasting damage from the scandal of his broken engagements and his callous treatment of Margaret during her pregnancy, details that had eventually leaked into society despite the family's best efforts at discretion. Elinor felt, when she thought of him at all, not anger but a distant, faded pity, the kind reserved for someone whose own poor choices had cost him a happiness he might otherwise have found. Charlotte Byron had left the city entirely within a year of her brief, unsettling return, choosing instead to settle in a smaller town some distance away, where Elinor understood she had eventually remarried, this time to a man of more modest but evidently kinder character than her first husband had proven to be. Whatever old feelings had once complicated her return to society, they had faded entirely from Elinor and Sebastian's life, leaving behind no lasting mark beyond the strengthened trust their marriage had gained from weathering that particular storm together. On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years to the day since their wedding, Elinor and Sebastian walked together through the garden at Ravensworth House, their children tucked safely into bed under the watchful care of their nurse. The same willow tree that had witnessed the beginning of their unusual courtship now grown taller still, its branches heavy with new leaves. "Do you ever think of that night?" Elinor asked as they paused beneath the familiar shade. "The ball, I mean, Julian and Margaret and everything that followed." "Occasionally," Sebastian admitted, "though it feels now like a story that happened to someone else entirely, rather than to us. I find it difficult to imagine my life without you in it. Elinor, difficult to imagine what kind of man I might have remained, had that particular evening unfolded differently." "I think of it sometimes too," Elinor said, "not with pain any longer but with a strange sort of gratitude. I was so certain that night that my life had been ruined beyond any hope of repair. I could not have imagined, standing in that garden with my heart breaking, that I would end up here, 5 years later, happier than I ever believed possible." Sebastian drew her close, resting his chin gently against the top of her head as they stood together in the fading evening light. "I made you an offer that night born entirely of practicality," he said. "I promised you protection and partnership and honesty, but I never dared to hope back then that I might also find genuine love within our arrangement. You gave me far more than I ever asked for, Elinor, simply by being exactly who you are." "And you gave me the same," Elinor said softly. "A chance to discover that love built slowly on trust and respect and genuine partnership could grow into something far more lasting than the kind of passion that fades as quickly as it arrives. I would not trade this life for anything, Sebastian, not for the world." They stood together beneath the willow tree as the stars began to emerge overhead. The same quiet, steady contentment that had marked so many of their evenings together settling comfortably between them once more. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, unaware of the strange, difficult beginning that had eventually led to their own happy existence. Somewhere in the countryside, Margaret tended to her own growing family, the shadow of her past mistakes long since transformed into hard-won wisdom and genuine contentment. And somewhere else entirely, Julian lived out whatever consequences his own choices had earned him, a distant footnote in a story that had, against every expectation, become one of genuine, lasting love. Eleanor Winslow, once a heartbroken young woman standing alone in a darkened garden, had become the Duchess of Ravensworth, a wife, a mother, and a woman who had learned, through hardship and careful, deliberate choice, exactly what it meant to build a life worth having. The ball that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the very beginning of everything she had come to treasure most, proof, if she had ever needed it, that sometimes the greatest happiness arrives disguised as the darkest heartbreak, waiting patiently for the courage to reach toward something better than what had been lost. As the last light faded from the evening sky, Sebastian took her hand, and together they walked back toward the warm, glowing windows of their home, toward the life they had built together, deliberately and honestly, from the very first difficult night that had brought them, against every expectation, to exactly where they were always meant to be.